Biggish stars end their lives with a catastrophic explosion. The material that's exploded goes off into space, and we are left with this shrunk core now spinning quite rapidly, and that's basically how the pulsar comes into being. They swing a beam of radio waves around the sky, a bit like a lighthouse. And when that beam shines in your eyes, so to speak, or on a radio telescope, you pick up a pulse. So it's going pulse, 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 pulse. The radio telescope, this particular one, really looks like an agricultural frame, what you might grow peas up or something like that. But there's 4 acres of it, so that's about 57 tennis courts. So it's huge. Not visually attractive in any sense, no nice bowl-shaped thing, the way some radio telescopes have, so it looked quite primitive. One of the things that a large radio telescope does is pick up human-generated interference, and one of the things I had to do was to identify what was interference and what was the quasars that I was meant to be looking at. Just occasionally there would be something that I couldn't recognize, and I'd record it with a question mark. And obviously at some level this lodged in the back of my mind, because after it had appeared a few times, my brain said, "You've seen something like this before, haven't you?" And I knew this was distinctly unusual. I didn't know what it was, but I took the trouble to phone Tony Hewish, my supervisor, who was teaching in an undergraduate laboratory in the university that afternoon. And after a few minutes he came to the telephone, and I told him it was a string of pulses 1 1/3 seconds apart, and he said, "That settles it. It's man-made." And in one sense he was right, because that's just the kind of interference you might get from somebody's electrical equipment in the next door lab. But what he hadn't folded in was that this was keeping its place amongst the stars. Tony came out to the observatory the next day at the appropriate time and stood looking over my shoulder and saw the pulses come in with his own eyes. He became more convinced then. So the next job was to see if another telescope with its own receiver could pick up these signals. So we went and stood by the pen recorder for this other radio telescope, and nothing happened. It was a horrible moment. It didn't appear. And we'd walked away along this long, long lab, and suddenly there was a shriek from Robin, "Here it is!" We came charging back up, and there it was. We had miscalculated by 5 minutes when that telescope would see it. If we'd miscalculated by 25 minutes, we'd have all gone home, and the story would be different. Women were not expected to be anything other than sex objects, wives, mothers, housewives. You weren't expected to have any brain. You weren't expected to have any career. Getting married was the goal. I was quite convinced I wasn't clever enough to be in Cambridge and that they would throw me out at some stage. But my policy was to work as hard as I could so that when they threw me out, I'd know I'd done my best. These days we know about imposter syndrome. We know about how young women are often treated. So we're wiser and older, but I think that was a pretty neat ploy on my part. This was the first time astrophysicists had won the Nobel Prize. My contemporaries were probably more upset than I was, and one of them labelled it the No-Bell Prize as opposed to Nobel Prize. But it was fine by me, and I was really rather proud that it was my stars that had convinced the prize committee that there was good physics in astrophysics.
To a woman scientifically proven to be the real deal, Jocelyn Bell Burnell.
This breakthrough prize happened very recently. I got an email from a US physicist, a very famous US physicist, Ed Witten, saying, could we have a telephone call? And he told me I'd won this prize. $3 million US. That breakthrough prize money is now being administered by the Institute of Physics. I was keen that the money should be used in a way to increase the diversity in physics. I think a very significant component in my discovering pulsars was the imposter syndrome. And if there had been more women around, I probably would not have suffered imposter syndrome. There'd have been somebody to talk to. I found the second pulsar about a month later, 3 weeks later. And that suggested that they were natural something. We didn't know what, but they're part of the universe. They're not little green men. It's not interference from the lab next door. It's not this problem. It's not that problem. It's a new kind of object, which were totally unexpected and totally unknown, and huge fun, therefore.